When we look at documents of this kind, then, we get a new angle of vision, and we see things that we could not see before. Women, for instance, lots of women. What historians are discovering that is, especially in guerrilla warfare, women were active participants in the war. With their men off fighting, they became the protectors. They were responsible for protecting their land, their possessions, their children. And often, they were the ones who protected their men. They became, in Victoria Bynum's phrase, the visible partner, like Sarah Cox and Martha Horn. They confronted the enemy, they supplied and fed friendly troops, they acted as spies, they gave testimony before the provost marshal, and they brought suits in court. The world did not turn upside down, but this war did twist gender roles and self-perceptions. Sarah Cox and Martha Horn do not conform to our image of the demure, helpless 19th century lady. In the fall of 1861, Sarah already knew that this war would require women to rely upon themselves and to protect others. And while we all know that that idealized vision of what a woman should be never really described reality, we also sense a fundamental difference in what was expected and required of women in Civil War Missouri. As Michael Fellman has pointed out, the ability to function within traditional roles was weakened, and values were weakened, altered, and at times reversed during guerrilla warfare. The simple act of testifying under oath suggests that a wife was not simply a femme covert, the legal term defining the legal existence of a wife subsumed under her husband. She could testify in court. She was a competent human being, perhaps even a citizen. When John Willis was charged with violation of the laws and customs of war, and that was the common charge for guerrilla activity, Nancy Brown gave testimony before the provost marshal. She swore that when Willis came to her house and stole her only horse, he had admitted to her that he was one of Hubbard's men, and he had been sent to steal horses for their scouts. Her testimony connecting Willis to this known guerrilla Hubbard was critical in establishing that Willis too was a guerrilla. In 1867, Amanda Ireland brought suit against 26 men, asking $5,000 in damage. You know what for? Death of her husband. She swore that they premeditatedly killed her husband. She got her judgment. The court attached the property of the defendants. She acted and was treated as a citizen. Oh, and her story is actually so complicated. It's really not necessary, but it's just so complicated. And it's a great example of how hard it is to know what really, really, truly happened with these guerrillas. Her husband was killed, there's no doubt about that, and these men did it. But it may be that these men killed her husband in retribution for a murder that he had committed. Now, what's motivating all these people? They all may have been very, very politically committed, and either Southerners or Northerners, and they killed because of differences in the war. Or they all could have been simply murderers and thieves. We really don't know. Amanda, poor grieving widow, whose husband was killed in the war. Or she could have been a sharp-eyed female in 1867, finding that a fine year to try to benefit from the end of the war and parlay her husband's death into patriotic act and punish those who were on the losing side. We may never know the motivation of any of these people, but we know that her husband was killed, she got a judgment, and the people who she got the judgment against. And we do know that Amanda was an active agent in protecting her interests at law. Too often, however, women were helpless in protecting their husbands. In the winter of 1862, a band of guerrillas attacked the home of Dr. Jacob Stemmons. He was having a meeting at his house of a group of Union supporters. So, guerrillas on the outside, Unionists on the inside, they're exchanging shots. Dr. Stemmons comes out on his front porch to talk with the attackers. And he tells them he was ready to die if he must. But they ought not burn down his house, the only shelter for his wife and children, who would be left after he was gone. The guerrillas, some of whom had been Dr. Stemmons' patients, listened to his words and then shot him dead. They then proceeded to set the house on fire, and his wife Susan ran from the house clutching a 1-year-old baby. She got all her children out. As the house burned, the guerrillas threw Stemmons' body into the fire. She could save her children, but she couldn't save her husband. 3 years later, though, she filed a civil suit against all those men. She could do it because she knew who they were. They were former patients. Martha Clark was another wife who suffered at the hands of guerrillas. Her husband, Orange Clark, I have no idea why his name was Orange. Orange Clark was at that meeting at Dr. Stemmons' house, the night the house burned. Their family thereafter experienced repeated attacks by guerrillas. On one occasion, when the guerrillas invaded the home, one of them aimed a gun at her son. Before he could pull the trigger, Martha placed herself between her 12-year-old son and the guerrilla. Diverting his attention, her son escaped from the house. Now, there still was some of that feeling of what a manly man, how a manly man treats a white woman. Oops, she gets in there, so he doesn't shoot her. All of that is not gone. And it just pops up in weird ways, you know? On July, Martha Clark saved her son's life, but she wasn't able to save her husband's. On July 20th, 1864, Orange, who belonged to the Missouri Enrolled Militia, was on duty with a small detail grazing horses east of Carthage when a guerrilla band surprised them. Orange Clark had surrendered, but they shot and killed him anyway. Martha brings suit in 1866. Martha was evidently a hugely popular name in the mid-19th century. Martha Hood, another Martha, her husband was killed on that same day that Orange Clark was. She too got some justice in court. 15 guerrillas led by Thomas Livingston's second-in-command, David Rusk, took her husband captive. Martha testified that before her very eyes, the guerrillas allowed one of their own, Richard Fisher, to shoot her husband. William Hood lingered and languished in great misery and bodily pain for 8 days before he died. But she could name the man who pulled the trigger. She knew him.